category of challenges that we face is infrastructure. And part of that is the negative side effect of the generally positive story of growth. We're just putting a bigger and bigger burden on our infrastructure. We see it with what's been happening with power over the last couple of weeks. Certainly anyone who rides the subway regularly sees it. You see it driving on our roads. And we have to invest in maintaining the infrastructure that we have and expanding that infrastructure to accommodate growth. And then the third challenge I think that we face is, frankly, the challenge of politics and government. And I think that comes in lots of different flavors. You have significant hostility to growth and development, which I have to say, in fairness, is partially our own fault. I think we've done a very poor job explaining why growth is important, but I also think that a lot of things that the real estate industry has done over the last several years have been too self-interested. And I think that it's time for the real estate industry to get back into the business of thinking of what's good for the city being good for the industry, which I think is not only the right way to think about things, but also in the long run will build a lot of goodwill and make it easier for us to get our message across. But we have challenges with the city budget that has grown exponentially, and that does fine when the city is growing. We'll see how it does when the city goes through a recession, which it will at some point. There's a lot of hostility in Albany, and then it's probably not even worth taking the time to talk about the problems with Washington. But immigration policy, tax policy, all of those over time could have a dramatic impact on the city as well.
So I think Seth did an amazing job summarizing that, and I would just also highlight one thing he said, which is immigration policy, which I think it's been a huge part of the growth of New York City over, since its inception. And anyone who touches our world of construction, from small contractors to large contracting firms, feels that lack of labor force, whether it's unskilled labor up to skilled labor, which is largely, I think, in the last 10, 20 years been filled by immigrants. And I think it's something that our industry should also pick up.
I think two other dynamics that we're focused on, taking the question in a slightly different direction, but there is in our mind a significant supply-demand imbalance with these new construction condo projects. And so how all of that inventory, you've seen absorption decrease dramatically, how all that inventory works its way through the system will be very telling, and I think you will see opportunities arise out of that distress. And then secondly, I think everyone walking around Manhattan, certainly these days, sees a lot of empty storefronts. And so we've witnessed over the past couple of years a repricing not only of high street retail, but of urban retail. And I think that from that repricing, we may see opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. One of the things that I started seeing, I've been living in New York, mostly Brooklyn, my entire life. When I used to travel the trains and saw a tourist on certain lines going in certain directions, I knew they were lost. And one of the things that's interesting is when you go to a lot of these neighborhoods that we've been talking about and a lot of neighborhoods that are being developed, it's this New York City is now expanding so far, whether it's Williamsburg in Queens or Brooklyn or Westchester. And it's just great to hear about all the exciting stuff. Long Island actually is also now becoming, a lot of people are staying out there instead of the city because it's just a nice area. So, I mean, that's something that I always look forward to in watching these areas change and grow. We have a few minutes to open up to questions for the panelists. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Mr. Metzer, you talked earlier about the industry itself doing a poor job of getting ahead of the affordable housing crisis and how there should be more policy discussion. I wondered if you could expand on that and give us any ideas of how you think the real estate industry can help itself in this situation.
Sure. I think, again, as Seth said, I think that the industry has done a great job lobbying for specific projects, or individual developers know how to go to their council members, know how to go to the mayor's office or the governor's office. But I don't think the industry has either worked with government to, that's where, again, whether it's do the right thing or look at policy for the benefit of the city overall, which will be to everyone's benefit. But also, I think we need to go outside of our government, reliance and relations, and go more directly to communities. And a lot of us, specialize in a certain borough or certain communities. I know that, my business has been only in low-income communities, mostly in Upper Manhattan, and our office is located there. We have purposely, both because we're geared this way and we think it's good business, reached out to everyone from tenant activists to locally based not-for-profits, artists, small businesses, public housing, and tried to build bridges. And again, just to circle back to how we started, legal outreach started in our neighborhood. That's how coincidentally, I got to know James. I haven't done as much for them as Shimon has, but we are connected to these types of groups in our neighborhood. And as an industry, there needs to be a focus on that. We need to figure out how to do that. So, we're not responsible for gentrification, which is now considered a bad thing, for growth, which is now considered a scary thing. These are complicated policy issues, and we're part of the solution. I don't believe we are either the problem or the sole problem.
Any other questions?
For those who own rent-stabilized multifamily assets, what will be your strategy moving forward? And in the near future, will people be acquiring stabilized or partially stabilized assets?
I mean, so we, again, it's a nuanced world, right? So it's, if you have a rent-stabilized building where it's 80% free market in the West Village, it's very different than something that's 100% rent stabilized in a lower income area. So for us, we don't have anything that's 100% stabilized. So our buildings that are mostly free market, I think will be by and large, the same. I think there'll probably be a little bit more investor appetite. I think for the really rent stabilized stuff, I think you're going to see tremendous drop in value where people are going to now almost look at it the flip side. People used to buy it at almost any cap rate. It didn't matter because they were only looking at the upside. So you could buy a 1 or 2 cap if you were buying it for $120 a foot. You said, look, it's $120 a foot. It would cost $300 to build it. So this is great. And anyone that gets that is bought out or moves out, the rent goes up. Now the rent can't go up at all. So it's almost the flip side. So I think stuff like that's going to trade for 6 and 7 caps. Obviously, depending on where the market goes, but I think that things will trade for 6 and 7 caps, and people will buy it and keep it and preserve it, and I think it'll be a new, type of buyer and owner. And, look, hopefully, I think some of the things that we're talking about, that, there were some abuses in the real estate industry for sure, and that led to a lot of this, anti-gentrification, anti-landlord, anti-development thing. So I think that, that may be something that's very different, where people will just own it and operate it, and the rents will be where they are. They're not going to really go up, and you'll have to just manage expenses well.
I would also say that it would be interesting to see whether some of the worst aspects, and I say worst not from a real estate owner's perspective, but from a public policy perspective, some of those worst aspects of the rent regulation changes over time aren't changed in some way. I'm not sure that we're going to get back to the world that we were in 6 months ago in the foreseeable future. In fact, I'm pretty sure we won't. But I could imagine over time that people will come to realize that this law went too far and in fact is actually harming the tenants in some ways that it was meant to protect.
And I think, Seth, I think you're 100% right. And I think, I was talking to somebody yesterday. I think that the laws, the real bad parts of the laws will slowly get chipped away. I don't think there's going to be a sweeping, people are talking about that there's going to be a sweeping change. There's not going to be any sweeping changes politically. I think that what people will see is that the few things that are really problematic over time will get changed. But I don't think you're going to have a sweeping thing in the near future.
So I fear that's too optimistic. I fear if you look
can't ruin our morning already.
Yeah.
Come on, wait till
I fear if you look at the Amazon, for instance, there was no sentiment on the people who were against that maybe there was a mistake or maybe there was a way to fix this or make it better. It was, we showed the man. And my feeling is that this legislation is a similar thing. It's not based on policy. It's not based on we might have overshot. It is we're in charge now and we're punishing. That's how long it takes to unwind that. I don't know, but that's my fear.
Can I ask a question? So, Mr. Metzner, you brought up the fact that we as a community or as an industry should do a better job of engaging the neighborhood, the community, such as Shimon has done with legal outreach. The leader of these laws, Julia Salazar, did not come from that kind of place. She came from a well-to-do family, and she is quoted saying she is a Marxist. She doesn't believe in private property rights. So I tend to agree with you, and I am asking, why is this going to change? This is where she comes from.
Right. So I think like a lot of things in our world today, there's a lot of this idea of moral signaling. Right. It's very easy to take a morality position and say somebody else is very bad. As I said, in this case, it's ironic that government and their relationship to housing, or in New York City and NYCHA versus we're the bad guys, but NYCHA is fraudulently signing lead paint affidavits and can't provide heat in their housing. But I do think it gets back to, again, I don't have an answer for it, but I think that we have to go around government to the extent we need to. And my personal feeling is that I have nothing against, to the extent that we can't, as an industry, engage in rational conversations with elected officials, we should target them to be defeated in elections, and like any other industry.
I think also people should vote. These elections, the Salazar election, when you look at the number of people that vote, it's abysmally low. So when you have a simple message like that, and it's easy to demonize one group, and I think that by changing that, where it's doing a better job explaining to the voters that real estate is not responsible for this, gentrification, whatever that means, it means different things, and explaining to people that we are creating jobs, we are creating a service, we're creating housing, we're doing all of this stuff. I think that by, it's so easy to say your rent is high because of these guys, because they're greedy landlords, right? That's the easy message. But to the extent that we as an industry start to explain to people that it's not that way, I think that things will change over time. And I think that the overall legislative body is not of that ilk. I think that, you do have some extremists, but I think that there are a lot of people that are far more in the middle.
And if I can just add one other thing, I think that's a really important point, which is that we live in a society now where the most extreme voices are amplified the loudest, but those are not necessarily representative of where the center of power lies. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of these laws are statewide laws, and that the state of New York is quite a diverse place, and that the margin of power in the state legislature in some ways goes through the suburbs. And the suburbs, I would say, are much more moderate than the city is in certain parts of the city. And so I think thinking about the importance of suburban legislators and the role that they can play to balance things in Albany is an important part of this. But I think in order for our message to get through, one, we have to build bridges to other communities. It can't just be the real estate industry pushing policies on its own. But two, also, we have to be less greedy. And we have to acknowledge that we can't always win and other people lose, which is the way I think it was perceived to be for many, many years at various levels of government and in many communities. And also, we have to advocate for things that in the short term may in fact not even be good for us, but are good for the city and are good for the region and are good for the state. Because in the long run, again, and I said this before, in fact, our success depends on the success of those places. And if you want to build goodwill over time, you have to look like you care about more than just your own industry.
And one other thing that these politicians are going to start realizing is what the alternate reality is. And as the real estate properties goes down, that means less real estate taxes for them. And as the people announce that they're not improving properties as much as they did, there was an announcement, I think you mentioned it before, that a lot of these larger landlords have no incentive to make the improvements they wanted to make. The hope is that they'll start realizing that some of these laws need to be adjusted. Maybe not repealed, I think what you said is correct, but there will be adjustments and hopefully for the better.
We have time for one or two more questions.
I wanted to ask you about NYCHA. We've seen one or two instances where private developers have worked with NYCHA. Do you see that as any kind of way that the real estate developers can come in and their unique, efficient way show the city how to run their housing stock and improve a stock that they don't seem able to fix?
I mean, I can go down the road. I mean, my feeling is without the private sector, NYCHA cannot fix itself.
Nationwide, they have RAD, right, which is just the privatization of it. I think if you look at NYCHA, it's a failure. I think something has to be done. Obviously, it's a very nuanced thing. It's hard to blame the current people in charge of NYCHA. This has been going on for 50 years, but I just don't think that government is the best setup, to run housing. And NYCHA is a prime example of it. So I think that there needs to be things done, whether it's the private sector, whether it's a combination of the private sector and the nonprofit sector, which is, I think, what a lot that's happening. I think that the proposals that they're going to do for NYCHA, are good things. It needs to be renovated. We need to put a lot of money into it. And unfortunately, we've let it get to such, a dire situation that's, it's really, it's sad to think what we let happen to it. So it needs to happen. And I think that we're at the point now that it's so drastic that, people are okay with bringing private sector into something that would have never been feasible years ago. I think the question is just, we are still talking about the affordability and all this other stuff. I think the issue is just how do you get the revenue for the residents that actually live there, and then how do you rehab? I think it's about 180,000 units. So the logistics of doing that, what do you say to the folks that live in the one that's going to be rehabbed in 20 years from now? What happens over the next 20 years, right? So it's sort of unfair to the folks that. Right, the ones that get rehabbed immediately are great, but what about 15 or 20 years? So it's a big issue, and I think that it's probably a multi-pronged solution.
Yeah, I think though it's also important to remember, somebody who spent a fair amount of time in government, that the private sector, I think, can bring resources, they can bring discipline to the table. But one, if the private sector is forced to operate under the same rules that the public sector has operated under, which often happens, that they're not going to be any more effective than the public sector has been. People who work for the public sector aren't all stupid and lazy. A lot of them are handcuffed by the rules that are imposed on them. And then the second thing I would say is that while the private sector can do amazing and very positive things in areas like public housing, there are sometimes perverse and misaligned incentives between the public and the private sector, and you need to make sure that there's a regulator there who's paying close attention and ensuring that the residents of NYCHA, who are some of the most vulnerable people in our city, are actually getting the benefit of the bargains that were struck. And the last thing I would just say is I also think it's important that we not let one party off the hook, which is that public housing was built as based on an agreement between cities and states and the federal government. And the federal government in that bargain was supposed to support public housing and provide the funding that would be necessary to maintain it over time and to allow rents to be affordable to the most vulnerable residents of the region. And the federal government has largely ceded that role. That is where the true crime here. And it's something that I think a lot of us lose sight of. But I think that the federal government should be held to account for what's happened as a result of their stepping back from this obligation that they agreed to many, many years ago.
I think that's true, but I think the federal, you can look back to the original policy and say that the idea of warehousing poor people, needs to be looked at with fresh eyes, and so I don't think it's just bricks and mortar and building new buildings. I think, again, we need to somehow get back to looking at housing policy with everything that's been learned post-World War II, and include, tenants, government, private sector, not-for-profits. It's a huge undertaking.
One more question. Anybody?
Mayor, can you tell us more about the benefit of a special zone?
The opportunity zones? Yeah, the opportunity zone has two real benefits to it. One benefit is you can defer your gain. So if somebody has a gain on the sale of stock or the sale of real estate in some cases, they can put the gain only, not the whole amount, into these funds that invest in these opportunity zones and defer those gains for 6 or 7 years and pick up 85% of the gain in year 6 or 7. It's a little complicated in terms of what the fund has to do, but the benefit is you get to defer the gain for that period of time. The interesting thing is, unlike a like-kind exchange where you have to put 100% of the sales proceeds into the new building, in these cases you only have to put the actual gain, which allows you to recoup some of your original basis in the investment. The other thing people are talking about is if you hold the property for longer than 10 years, you can sell it at no gain or loss, period. So if you make money on the deal, then you can actually just not pick up the gain. It's tax-free. Part of the issue, and this is something that I don't think anybody really knows, there's a lot of demand now for properties that there was very little demand for before, and if the pricing is premium to what the price was before these rules came out, what's the gain really going to be in 10 years from now? Nobody really knows. Part of the issue is the regulations that came out over a year after the law was passed, and they're still not clarifying certain things. So there's been a very, very bad job of the federal government in going through these rules carefully. They actually came out with a lot of clarification that was more favorable than people expected, but up until June 28th, which is 180 days from December 31st, there was very little talk until about the last month or two of a lot of these people setting up the funds.
I would say what's, I guess what you're describing is what happens when you pass a major overhaul of the tax bill.
Actually, a series of major overhauls.
But I actually think the interesting opportunity in opportunity zones is not so much in the opportunity zones that I think most people are focused on today, which I would refer to as the primary opportunity zones. There are a lot of places that have been designated opportunity zones where there was a lot of development taking place already. And there you're seeing exactly the phenomenon that you were describing, where land prices have risen, or at least the asking prices have risen to a level where it makes it hard to get the benefit of the opportunity zone program. But there are a whole host of what I would describe as secondary and tertiary opportunity zones where truly very little activity has occurred, and there are very few people still in the market looking at properties in those places. And there, I think, there are real opportunities for making investments and using this program and taking projects that previously were not viable and using the tax benefits to make them viable and achieving the goals of the program.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Seth, David, Michael, and thank you so much for joining. We learned a lot. We spend as more coffee for the back.